Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, in the 19th century, the British Empire used its gunboats to open Africa and Asia to the forces of British capital. In 2003, the United States Imperial Military did the same thing to open Iraq's oil fields for the Halliburton Corporation. On this side of the House, we believe that for 150 years, global capital has been making people go to war in its name, and we think that's a disgrace. Two things at opening government. Firstly, why unfettered capitalism creates the motive for states to go to war with each other, and secondly, why it creates the ability for them to do so and perpetuates those conflicts. Before that, what do we stand for? A few things. Firstly, we are not going to attempt at opening government to give you a complete definition of unfettered capitalism. That would be a PhD thesis. I only have 7 minutes. Here are a few features that we think may be relevant for this debate. Firstly, unfettered capitalism places great power in the hands of large corporations. Secondly, it places a disproportionate amount of wealth in the hands of a very small number of people within society. Thirdly, it encourages and forces open and completely free trade and the completely free flow of capital between nations. And fourthly, it places the acquisition of material goods as a primary goal within society. We mean global unfettered capitalism, both internationally and nationally. A few clarifications. Hugh and I are not communists. We concede that capitalism may have many other benefits. This is a debate specifically about peace. What we contend is that those features of capitalism, specifically as they are not limited in any way, create conflict. There isn't going to be an extensive gov model. Lastly, very briefly, what do we mean by the term greatest? Well, firstly, we don't think it's a reasonable burden to ask opening gov to stand up here and compare every possible form of conflict to unfettered capitalism. Rather, we're going to say two things. Firstly, we think unfettered capitalism is a huge source of conflict. Secondly, that it is also the root of other sources of conflict. So, for instance, as I'm going to show in my speech, things like ethnicity, things like religious divides, which also cause conflict, we contend have unfettered capitalism and the inequality it promotes at their base. So, firstly, why does global capitalism create the motive for international conflict? 4 reasons. The first is the idea of resource wars. What we contend is that because global capitalism, rather than sharing resources out between nations and between peoples, creates a mismatch between the demand for natural resources in rich nations like the United States, like China, and their location, that encourages those nations to either go to war or prevent intervention in international conflicts in order to acquire those resources. We think that that is in fact at the base of many, if not most, no thanks Seb, of the world's conflicts at the moment. Either because China prevents action to topple a brutal Burmese regime or a brutal Sudanese regime because it needs access to their oil and gas, or because the United States fights conflicts, for instance, in Afghanistan over those things. Secondly, Richard.
I think you'll find that it's mercantilism and the hoarding of resources rather than freely trading them, which is what creates the incentives to invade other countries.
No, Richard, because it is still the case that even under global capitalism, people own natural resources, and other people would like to own them because that makes it cheaper for them to exploit them. That's why it is better for Halliburton to have a stake in Iraq's oil fields than to buy them on fair terms from the Iraqi people. Second reason for motive. Global unfettered capitalism creates military-industrial complexes. What do we mean by this? Well, arms companies, immensely powerful arms companies, often control the politics of Western nations. How do they do that? Firstly, because they have immense power in terms of donating money to politicians. Often their former CEOs serve in administrations. Both Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld had worked for Halliburton before they were part of the Bush administration. But also because diverse stock portfolios mean the same people that benefit from arms companies doing well also control the media in Western nations. That allows, for instance, the shareholders of Fox to encourage them to promote conflict because they know that ultimately they'll profit from it. Third reason, global capitalism, unfettered capitalism specifically, without adequate things like financial regulation, leads to continual boom and bust cycles. That means downturns where nations become significantly poorer than they were before. In those downturns, we see a rise in nationalism because people are scared, because they seek scapegoats, because they want somebody to blame and they want somebody else to band together with as an insurance policy to share out their scarce resources. That nationalism in turn encourages conflict. Look at the way that Thatcher and Reagan perpetuated conflicts across the world in the 1980s in the name of nationalism to distract from their economic failings at home. Fourthly, we're going to contend that ethnicity specifically is grounded in inequality, material inequality. Why is that? Because difference between ethnicities is not natural. It's not something that's in our blood or in our biology. Rather, it is something that must be constructed by ethnic demagogues. How do those demagogues do that? Because they look at existing inequalities between people created by unfettered capitalism that make one group rich and one group poor and attribute that to ethnicity. No thanks, Seb. Secondly, how does capitalism create the ability to perpetuate conflict? Firstly, because it makes a large number of people, particularly in Western nations, very poor. What does that do? It creates a large army of people, often with very few other prospects, who it's very easy to encourage to join your military. That's important, firstly, because it gives you a large number of willing recruits into your army in order to fight a large number of conflicts, but also because it means that those people don't fight back against those conflicts, even when they are materially to their disadvantage. That's vital for fighting foreign wars. Secondly, because capitalism, inasmuch as it is at base an essentially amoral system which considers only acquisition and not ethical decision making when it decides where to buy from, funds like rebel groups, it funds foreign armies. That's why, for instance, so few Western nations have meaningful constraints on the ability to purchase minerals from zones of international conflict. Those capital flows from mineral purchases in turn allow those rebel groups to continue working. Thirdly and finally, because capitalism has at its root innovation, so it rewards companies who are able to create more innovative and more effective ways of killing people. That means that corporations like Lockheed Martin, like Boeing, are able to get rich by creating better ways of death. Those are ultimately more lethal, that makes wars longer, it makes them more brutal. Ladies and gentlemen, what does unfettered capitalism do? It makes the politicians of the world want to go to war. It makes their people believe in those wars. It makes their young men poor and desperate enough to fight them, and then it puts newer and better guns in their hands to do it. We are very proud to propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I apologize about the bell not working. I think this should do better. Yeah, that's better. I'd now like to invite the Leader of the Opposition from Ateneo de Manila.
There are three burdens of proof that we want to take on coming from opening opposition. Firstly, we think that if a greater obstacle for world peace than unfettered capitalism exists, then this motion must fall. But secondly, we want to prove, ladies and gentlemen, is that capitalism itself is not an obstacle to world peace at all, but a possible tool toward that world peace. What we would posit, ladies and gentlemen, is that the freer capitalism gets, the greater the potential for world peace becomes. But thirdly, we want to prove, ladies and gentlemen, that comparatively, capitalism is the most appropriate economic system to match people's unlimited needs with the world's scarce resources, and therefore is a legitimate means to establish peace all over the world. Before I move on to my substantive points, let's take a look at the case that we heard coming from the previous speaker. All of the things that the previous speaker told us, ladies and gentlemen, were why capitalism is harmful. He told us that it allows a military-industrial complex to exist, it rewards rebel groups, and it rewards innovation that kills people. But what we need to question, ladies and gentlemen, is the mutual exclusivity of these harms. Because our question for Proposition Bench in this debate is that if we were existing within any other system, if we had any other system other than capitalism, we question, would these harms not exist. We tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that whether or not we have capitalism, all of these harms will exist because the root cause of these conflicts are going to be human greed and the desire for human power. We think that it's unfair for them to attribute that solely to capitalism. We think that any structure at all that creates power, that entrenches power, is bound to create this greed, is bound to create all of the harms that they posit. So we think that the causality that they wanted to show in this debate is going to be extremely tenuous. And that's why we think that the case of the previous speaker was not mutually exclusive at all to what capitalism is all about. Because we're not going to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that capitalism is perfect, but what we're going to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, is that relatively it works. Because what we need to say, ladies and gentlemen, to contend with all of these ideas coming from Proposition Bench, is that we need to dissociate greed from capitalism. Because what we tell you, ladies and gentlemen, is that greed and the yearning for power is not inherent to capitalism, but we think that it is in fact this greed and that this yearning for power that becomes the absolute obstacle for peace. So while we may say, ladies and gentlemen, that the capitalist system is a tool for some people to grab power, it is unfair to attribute that hunger for power purely to capitalism. But moreover, what we would say, ladies and gentlemen, is that a huge factor behind greed is a monopoly of power. We think capitalism, relative to communism or relative to any other economic system, distributes wealth more equally than any other economic system, and that's why greed and hunger for power become less likely. Because what we would say, ladies and gentlemen, is that any structure that has a human element is bound to create greed. It's bound to lead to all the harms that Proposition Bench is talking about. So given that greed is inevitable, what we would like to say, ladies and gentlemen, is that the extents to which greed occur are significantly lower because of capitalism. I'm going to discuss later aspects of social justice, corporate social responsibility, and social enterprises that are exclusive to capitalism in my substantive material. So before that, sure.
Name me one capitalist incentive for us to spend money helping a person who might not be productive to the rest of society.
If you take a look at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, ladies and gentlemen, it's donated $36 billion to solving a vast number of diseases in Africa. You can tell me, ladies and gentlemen, that Bill Gates doesn't really have any utilitarian motive in order to help these people, but it's capitalism that allowed him to do that. And we think that that's fundamentally why you can't say that capitalism is useless and that capitalism is fundamentally greedy. There are 4 points of substantive that I want to make. Firstly, we need to understand what really causes conflict. It's the unlimited desire in the midst of scarcity. In the midst of scarcity. And this was something that the previous speaker talked about as well. But what capitalism does with respect to every other alternative is capitalism manages the scarcity. It matches the need with the currently available resources. If we take a look at all of the other alternatives, what they simply do is that they repress the needs and make sure that everybody has a basic amount of sustenance. We think firstly, it's extremely difficult to do this given growing populations everywhere. But secondly, we think that this act of repression in itself is in direct opposition to world peace. Because we need to expand our understanding, ladies and gentlemen, of world peace. It's not simply the absence of conflict. We think we're also talking about people living their lives on the ground, people being happy, people having peace of mind. In the status quo, ladies and gentlemen, we see a world that has liberated man more than ever before. We think that man now is more capable of rational thought, more capable of deciding what to do with property. So we think that the quality of life and world peace fundamentally doesn't mean subsistence, but choice. And we think that there is something that is fundamentally exclusive to a capitalist model. Second point, we think that capitalism best addresses human need. If we take a look at all the other alternatives, they demand you to have a control of the market, to have a control of resources. So in these situations, people may have what they need, people will have 3 square meals a day, but we think that they will definitely not be happy when they do not have any choice, when they have no expanded range of options. Because we think that in the effort to streamline production in these particular economies, these alternatives necessarily limit people's freedom. But how exactly is capitalism better in addressing people's needs? We think theoretically it optimizes a match of need and the availability of economic resources. If we're talking about the invisible hand, it's fundamentally dictated by supply and demand, and we think that it creates niche markets that are able to cater to everybody at the very end of the day. Third point, we think that capitalism has created spaces for freedom. I already flagged earlier that there are indeed consumer choices for people, but we think capitalism is the most empowering force to the private sector actors. We think that when you give the right to property and a capitalist mentality, you create a middle class that is more critical of government action and that demands good governance. We're talking about non-governmental organizations, social and civic groups. We think that these are the people that pressure the state to mind special interests. Because when people only know subsistence, when people do not live beyond these 3 square meals a day, we think that they will be in a position that they cannot question the government, wherein they will be uncritical. We think that these spaces for freedom are fundamentally important in terms of how people perceive world peace. Because, ladies and gentlemen, we think that all of the harms that they've outlined in this debate thus far are not necessarily attributable to capitalism, but we think all of these harms are attributable to human greed. But moreover, what we would like to say, ladies and gentlemen, is that we limit human greed through the capitalist model, and because we best allocate resources through this model, we're very proud to oppose this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition. I would now like to invite the second speaker from Bank Rakyat, Oxford.
Is that okay? Yeah. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. They would have you believe that capitalism frees people, that it is a rising tide that lifts all boats, and that it lifts those boats into free and prosperous waters. What we tell you on side proposition is that rather, capitalism wants a global division of labor. It wants some people to stay poor, to work in its sweatshops, and it wants other people to remain rich, to buy the products produced in those sweatshops. They talk to you about philanthropy. What we tell you is that philanthropy in the early years of capitalism in Europe in the 19th century didn't do a whole lot to help the people trapped in Victorian poorhouses. What got redistribution, what got the middle class that they want to see develop was a long struggle of labor against capital. It was social movements, it was left-wing political parties, it was the welfare state. That is what we stand for on side government. What am I going to talk about? A couple of things. I'm going to briefly revisit this idea of mercantilism and hoarding. I'm then going to take a look at the idea of capital and authoritarianism and why those two groups make very happy bedfellows. And then thirdly, I'm going to take a look at the idea of capital mobility and how the crises that it creates lead to conflict. Before that, some more rebuttal. They talk to you about the idea that all the harms that Ben listed, and to which they had no specific responses, were down to the idea of some sort of general human need for greed and power. Well, maybe, but these general needs are channeled through different social structures. And our contention on side proposition is that capitalism is a social structure that makes that worse. Why? Because capitalism is a system that gives resources and power to those people who are best able and most willing to act upon greed as like a force of human action. It gives all the money and all the power to the greediest people, the people most willing to seek profit ahead of any sort of humanitarian or ethical concern, ahead of any sort of communitarian, no thank you, impulse. That's a problem. And like that isn't just like a broad conceptual point. Ben gave you a long list of ways in which capitalism leads to violence. He talked about resource wars. He talked about cleavages in levels of resources leading to ethnic tensions. All went unresponded to by the previous speaker, who merely accused us of not running a comparative. No thank you. In a debate like this, we don't need a model. What we do need to tell you is that we've traced out some specific causal links between capitalism as a structure and like war. What we support on proposition is the reduction of these causal links, the reduction of the power of companies, the reduction, no thank you, of untrammeled power of capital to flee places. Finally, they talk about choice. What we tell you on this, Madam Speaker, is that we like choice. And we aren't necessarily in favor of restricting all forms of trade, something that's already been made explicitly clear by my teammate. What we do think is that capitalism as a system that allows those people who control resources, no thank you, to pay very low wages to the vast majority of people, disempowers most people, because it means that those people don't have any choice in what they do. They accept the job that they have to take if they want to feed their kids, and that's their life. So, hoarding. What we tell you, as far as what we get from Vic Wellington as on the grounds of mercantilism, is that even if resources were to be freely traded, firstly, that still wouldn't deal with a lot of our analysis about things like arms companies and how giving power to them leads to more war that is incidentally self-perpetuating because they have a continued incentive to fund more wars, to continue to expand their businesses. But more importantly, and I'll take you in a moment, more importantly, ownership is key, right? Even with free trade, you still need to own resources in order to be able to extract rent from them, right? The big incentive is not simply to buy oil from people, but to control the oil wells, because that's where the big profit is. And when large corporations can gain power within particular countries, they create the incentive for leaders there, like, to take part in oil wars, to seize control of that oil. That incentive is lessened to the extent that the power of large companies is lessened.
Under a capitalist model, every single country and every single person is a potential market. Doesn't that mean you're not going to go to war against those people that you want interdependence and to react well with them?
Not at all, right? Because there are various other things that corporations want from people apart from to be markets. Firstly, they want to keep various people poor in order that they can remain as cheap labor. That's something I've already said in my magnificent peroration. Secondly, you may be a capitalist company that has a specific interest in the engagement of war above and beyond markets, right? If you're an arms company, you're not planning to sell machine guns to the people on the streets of your average country. Rather, you want to sell weapons to the government of the United States, and as such you militate in favor of war, particularly when those countries are very poor. Other corporations don't really care about the market they're losing, so the incentive of capital is clear. Finally, what we tell you is that on the point of hoarding, my first substantive, is that the poverty created by capitalism, the boom and bust cycles, encourages hoarding of resources further, because it makes people feel more insecure, more than just if they had never developed in the first place. Secondly, capitalism and authoritarianism. What we tell you here is that capital does not in fact like democracy. Why not? One, it wants there to be fewer workers' rights, so it can pay people less, it can work them harder, and it can make them work in cheaper and less safe and less pleasant conditions. Two, democratic systems which involve regular changes of government and changes of policy involve less certainty for capitalists who want to plan for the future economically. Three, it is easier to control a puppet government through bribing it than it is to control the people in general. Moreover, capital has the ability to undermine democracy, right? Large corporations can pay for mercenary armies. They can influence capitalist governments to take part in coups and invasions. There are examples of this happening. They're easy to think of. The installation of the Shah in Iran because of US oil interests. The installation of Pinochet in Chile because, again, of US interests. What we tell you is that in all of these cases, and in many more, that there's a clear incentive for capital to bring in authoritarian regimes. This leads to more war, because dictators are less accountable to their people and are often connected to armies, so need to keep those armies wealthy and will listen to the belligerence of generals. And capitalism, when untrammeled, in particular, doesn't build the kinds of middle classes that you want for the development of a stable democracy. You can't have that without proper redistribution. When it's just when it's a lack of redistribution, the middle classes that grow up are those with an incentive to maintain the current structure of society. That's bad. Finally, Madam Speaker, capital mobility. What we tell you here is very simple. It is true, as they say, that capitalism always wants to open new markets. It is also true, however, that capitalism has, at this stage in global society's development, quite a lot of options as far as what markets to invest in go, and may want to pull out of them at a moment's notice. It may also want to speculate against the currency of a nation in order to plunge it back into poverty. This is particularly dangerous because in the case of untrammeled capitalism, firstly, because global capitalists only seek profit, right? That's how they make money. And secondly, because they're insulated by the effect of what happens in their countries. We saw this in the South Asian crisis, in the East Asian crisis rather, in the 1990s, and we're seeing this right now in the Eurozone crisis that risks tearing apart an organization that has for the first time ever created peace in Europe. I'm referring, of course, to the European Union. So, Madam Speaker, it is with a great deal of pride that I stand for the last time in this tournament in proposition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. We now invite the second speaker of the opening opposition.
We just don't see in this side of the house why capitalism is the greatest obstacle coming from government. Because while they list, ladies and gentlemen, a number of reasons why we should regret it, like, ladies and gentlemen, people are fighting over money, that many people are greedy and capitalism facilitates it, we don't think that there has been a good response to the question we ask, ladies and gentlemen. Why is it the greatest one? And would these harms, ladies and gentlemen, have not happened, even in a communist system, even in an authoritarian system, ladies and gentlemen, and we think they're in fact worse. I have 4 points of rebuttal, and I have 1 point of substantive, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, the question, ladies and gentlemen, that they ask is, what capitalists want is that they want people to remain poor, and that there's a natural incentive for individuals to be greedy in this way. First of all, we think, ladies and gentlemen, that increasingly, we don't think that this is really the case. Because more and more, ladies and gentlemen, as people become aware, for example, of the existence of poor, ladies and gentlemen, the more and more people become educated to the awareness, ladies and gentlemen, that the more there are poor people, the more difficult it becomes to govern a government, ladies and gentlemen, to lead people, ladies and gentlemen. We think that's not the case. But second, we think a system of capitalism also empowers non-capitalists, ladies and gentlemen, who are products of that same capitalist system. What is the point? We think, ladies and gentlemen, that a capitalist system that forwards education, the freedom of ideas and media, ladies and gentlemen, has helped establish educated people, NGOs, ladies and gentlemen, and advocacies that are pro-peace, ladies and gentlemen, even under a capitalist system. Such that we say, ladies and gentlemen, even if you have wars conducted by a few individuals, we think that the vast majority of people are slowly going away from that, and the capitalist system has helped people become aware towards these things. We would say furthermore, that in an instance where you did not have a capitalist system, where everything was dictated, for example, by what one person thought was the best way to manage the economy, such that he would manipulate individuals, ladies and gentlemen, something like what North Korea would do, we think you don't have these individuals coming up with ideas on how we can establish a long-term understanding of what peace really is. Second, they talked about resource wars, ladies and gentlemen. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that the example of the United States is a bad one, specifically because we've come to recognize, ladies and gentlemen, that what they did was wrong. Such that, ladies and gentlemen, the problem that you face now is not that the capitalist system has created that, ladies and gentlemen, but maybe that these particular individuals in power, ladies and gentlemen, were the ones who made a mistake. Bush, for example, ladies and gentlemen, if he was put into power because of the capitalist system, ladies and gentlemen, we think it's not the same with Obama, for example, who was able to who put himself into power, ladies and gentlemen, even without the help of massive corporations. We think as time moves on, you will come to recognize that the trend towards using capitalism for power no longer exists as it did in the past. Sit down. Lastly, they talk about the idea of ethnicity, ladies and gentlemen. That, for example, you create more discrimination in an instance where you have capitalism. We would say, ladies and gentlemen, that first of all, this happens even, ladies and gentlemen, in non-capitalist systems. We think it's even further heightened, for example, when you grant monopolies of power to individuals, ladies and gentlemen, when they control state resources, for example, when they control where the money should go and all the money should be with them. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that the idea of control of governments doesn't work either. Why? First of all, we would say, ladies and gentlemen, that the idea of capitalism is a natural counterbalance to capitalism in itself. Given how, for example, markets correct themselves, we think the same goes with all political systems when money, for example, is used to influence these things. Such that in elections, ladies and gentlemen, if you have rich people sponsoring an evil candidate, ladies and gentlemen, we think you have rich people sponsoring other candidates as well. The point is, ladies and gentlemen, as far as politics is concerned, capitalism in itself is self-correcting. What about, ladies and gentlemen, a system that is not capitalist? What about a system where you grant power and the money and finances to individual people? Do you have such a counterbalance, ladies and gentlemen? We think, ladies and gentlemen, this side has not been able to prove that, and that's why we think they've been failing. Yes, sir.
When capitalism corrects itself, as we told you, that creates nationalism, that creates foreign conflict by desperate people. The corrections of capitalism also contribute to our case.
Sir, the idea of nationalism is something that may exist today or something that exists 50 years ago, ladies and gentlemen. But we think as time moves on, you come to recognize that people are becoming more and more aware of the idea of global citizenship, for example. The idea, ladies and gentlemen, that countries are interdependent. The idea that when the EU, for example, started to fail, we've come to recognize that the fault does not exist with one country, for example, but with all countries not being able to command, ladies and gentlemen, and control greed. What do we want to say? We think, ladies and gentlemen, that capitalist system produces a system where we can create ideas, ladies and gentlemen, that themselves are pro-peace, ladies and gentlemen. What are we talking about? First of all, we think the world peace in itself is a concept that we can barely conceive. We think they can't define it, we barely can define it, ladies and gentlemen. But what we want to say is that world peace must be an institutional, long-term concept, ladies and gentlemen. Because wars, for example, are in fact aftermaths of a greater cause, ladies and gentlemen, such as the inequality of power. We think, ladies and gentlemen, under a system that is not capitalist, there is no potential for people to recognize that the inequality of power is indeed a problem. What do we want to say? We say, first of all, that capitalism has produced a free exchange of ideas, ladies and gentlemen, through the media, for example. The idea of the private media, the idea of the public media, ladies and gentlemen, private schools, ladies and gentlemen, and all these types of things has helped spread ideas that help serve interests, ladies and gentlemen, of people that themselves are anti-power. Why do we say this? Because we think, ladies and gentlemen, if people want to serve their own interests first, we've come to recognize that in the world today there are many individuals who care about and their primary interest is helping other individuals. That's why you have, for example, advocacies on the environment, advocacies on the peace, animal rights, freedoms, ladies and gentlemen, of rights in all individuals. First of all, we would say that capitalism mobilizes these groups, ladies and gentlemen. It's through money, for example, that we're able to spread the word on human rights, women's rights, ladies and gentlemen, and we're using money, ladies and gentlemen, to forward such social propaganda which are in fact positive towards world peace. But second, and most importantly, this is something we think that a lot of many people in the first world don't really see, ladies and gentlemen, but we in the third world come to recognize day to day. That there's an alignment now of peace motives, ladies and gentlemen, and capitalism through ideas such as microfinance, ladies and gentlemen, especially in the third world, where people are now coming to recognize that you can earn money, ladies and gentlemen, by helping people. That you can actually, ladies and gentlemen, profit by helping the environment, ladies and gentlemen. We, for example, talk about ideas of what do you call this, public, we talk about ideas, ladies and gentlemen, like microfinance, where individuals, for example, are able to profit, ladies and gentlemen, without having the expense, ladies and gentlemen, of individuals. We talk about, for example, people benefiting from having a good reputation towards them and the environment. We talk about people, ladies and gentlemen, and companies who are able to benefit while at the same time, ladies and gentlemen, serving an interest that in itself is not utilitarian. What do we want to say? At the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, capitalism is in itself rocky. Capitalism itself has a lot of difficulties. But any other system, ladies and gentlemen, even the best case scenario, will never come to world peace. We think, ladies and gentlemen, if the problem is the inequality of power, we think that capitalism is the best way to solve such a thing. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, that marks the end of the first half of the debate. And now I'd like to invite the first speaker from the closing government to give his speech.
The problem about capitalism is that peace is an externality. It is something that can't be drawn up in a flowchart or in a pie graph to show you how much profit you've made. It's not something that will make your stockholders or your investors happy. Capitalism has no truck for human rights or dignity. That's why it's the cause of all these conflicts in the world today. I'm going to bring you two things in extension. Firstly, the environment. Why capitalism has literally created a system which will cause harm to billions of people today and in the future. Secondly, why it harms democratic power structures and entrenches undemocratic ones. But before that, some rebuttal. They found that there are worse barriers in capitalism, and the shining example of a worse barrier, note, was greed. We agree that some parts of human nature are ugly. We agree that, if human nature wasn't ugly, there would be no conflict in the world, right? That's just an absurd point. The problem is that capitalism specifically rewards the greedy the most, and so on top of our natural inclination to be bad some of the time, gives us extra incentives to be bad almost all of the time. An institutionalized system of greed is obviously quite a bad thing. We don't think that was a valid point to even make, right? That's the first response. Secondly, they told us, well, capitalism sometimes brings benefits. And the first thing they told us was, quite absurdly, capitalism tends to distribute wealth equally. Couple of reasons why this is just obviously wrong. Firstly, in a capitalist system, money tends to make money. The rich get richer because with money you get infrastructure, you get political say, no thank you, you get the ability to reinvest that money in a way that only further entrenches the inequality. So that was not true. Second reason, because capitalism is an active incentive to keep the poor people who produce goods as poor as they can, no thank you, so that the rich people can purchase these and the company can make as much profit as possible, right? We don't really like Marx on all points, but we think he was quite right when he pointed out why capitalism sucks in this particular respect. No thank you. Thirdly, we say capitalism is by definition biased in terms of those things which are short-termist and tangible, right? When something like human rights can't be measured in a spreadsheet, there's no reason for a company to take that into account when it perhaps makes your sales figures look a lot prettier. I'm going to talk about that later. They said, well, companies want to look good, no thank you. We tell you that's not true, right? The overwhelming incentive is still to make money, right? A company that makes losses is just never going to get any sort of investment. That's the overwhelming incentive. Then he said, well, capitalism, no thank you, often wants to provide education. There's a reason why people don't tend to like private schools and why states step in to provide schools all the time, because education creates benefits that accrue not to the individual, but to the whole of society. That's a problem by externalities, no thank you, because education often gives poor people inherent dignity with the way they live their lives, right? So if you're poor and you can't pay for education, capitalism has no truck with these intangible benefits, apart from the fact that you could pay for it. I'll take you now.
When the United States government goes to war on behalf of Halliburton, is that a problem with capitalism, or is it a problem with the feta that the government has in respect of control over going to war?
Well, it's a fact that democratic governmental structures have been hugely subverted by the capitalist mechanism. That's my extension. I'm happy you raised it up. Then what they tell us next is that, well, capitalism encourages the exchange of ideas. Yeah. Tell that to the millions of people who couldn't get a SARS vaccine because big pharmaceutical companies insisted on their having an intellectual right to own that, even though it could have helped millions of people around the globe. It's not true, right? Patents mean that by and large, ideas aren't shared freely in the capitalist system because having a monopoly over an idea gives you lots of money. That was an assertion that was just false, right? So we tell you on all these levels, it wasn't true, right? Last of all, they said, well, it tends to be self-correcting. Firstly, as opening Gov talked about, when it self-corrects, people tend to die. Those are harms that rather not accrue. Secondly, there's an incentive not to be self-correcting to the extent that, as I've already explained, inequality helps capitalism. Alright, extension. First point, environmental harm. A few things you want to say about capitalism. Firstly, it is inherently short-termist. Why? Because capitalism makes it very, very hard for any sort of company to endure any kind of short-term loss, right? That's why companies by and large tend to be risk-averse when you want to make profits. Because the moment you make like a quarterly loss, right, that's when people desert your company. That's when it's very hard to regain momentum. This is particularly damaging for companies which might have environmental incentives. Why? Because those harms, first of all, accrue in the very long term, right? It's often very hard to convince those people who want to invest in your company that what you're doing can be captured in that bare numerical fashion. Secondly, like it's very, very hard to convince these people that the technologies that are trying to develop, like green technology, are going to sell well in the short term. This means that companies tend to neglect these sorts of like huge long-term problems that are no less real for the fact that they accrue in the long run. Secondly, capitalism doesn't have any truck of externalities. Why is that the case, right? Because capitalism is a system where people and companies in general are encouraged to pay heed to nothing but their own self-interest. This is a particular problem, though, thank you, when we take into account things like the environment. Why? Because firstly, the benefits tend not to accrue to companies when people purchase that, right? By and large, the vast majority of benefit accrues to people who are not involved in that economic transaction in the first place, right? People around the world, no thank you, who benefit from not having a pollutive environment, right? Even when causality is very hard to draw. But even once we tell you, environmental concerns are hugely global in nature. That means there's no way any capitalist system can ever capture these harms and benefits. No, thank you. That's why there's huge systemic under-provision. And no, this is not a small problem. If they want us to fulfill that this is a real big problem, we point you to the fact that today there are more people in Africa fleeing from the effects of climate change than they are from the effect of all the combined civil wars and all the oppression by dictators in that particular context. No, thank you. We think this is capitalism's fault. We also tell you capitalism doesn't take into account problems of distribution. Because often, people within these countries are much more aware of those environmental harms when they do accrue in a short-term manner in a way that they can feel, right? A good example is what Shell did to the Odongo people in the Niger Delta. It went in and completely destroyed, no thank you, the communities and the environment. We pointed to what's happening in China, where big companies pollute massively because the people who have a stake in that environment have no ability to have a say over how that capital is used, because by and and large, these people are sitting in boardrooms in rich countries around the world and have no truck with these concerns. So that's why environmental harm is a real thing. Secondly, why does this subvert democratic power structures? Because democracies are ought to represent the people. The thing is, capitalism provides an alternative form of legitimation. How? Couple of ways. Firstly, funding of candidates, right? Secondly, by controlling discourses. The fact that democratic discourse is controlled by media companies means that they can polarize and manipulate it in any way they can, right? A very good example is Rupert Murdoch. Thirdly, we say capitalist bodies often have direct stakes in parliamentary bodies, right? We pointed to how in the UK, capitalist companies sponsor bills all the time and get them passed even to huge social detriment. Why is this bad? Because it results in the alienation of the poor at the point at which the political structures don't fail to take into account their interests. War is a huge harm, but it is also a huge detriment to peace when an entire underclass of people in a country feels systemically marginalized and alienated and disregarded by a system that has no truck for human rights or inherent dignity. For all these reasons, we're extremely proud to stand in proposition.
Thank you, sir. We now invite the first speaker of the closing opposition from Victoria University of Wellington.
The government narrative down that entire bench is that we live in a time where evil capitalists have wielded the levers of government to create perpetual poverty for many people and to create war. But if you actually look at the status quo, we live in the most peaceful time in the entirety of human history. We live in a time where the greatest gains in prosperity for the poorest in the world are occurring. Millions of people have been lifted out of poverty due to the operation of global capitalism and globalization. What we say, and this is the heart of our extension, is that capitalism is an important and fundamental counterbalance to people's innate desire to exercise state power against each other. It creates the incentives in place to create peace, and it creates the conditions that destroy inequality and the differences between man that causes them to go to war. So that's what we're going to talk about in this debate. But before that, I want to deal with closing government's rather random extension about the environment. I'm not quite sure what the environment has to do with peace, but we'll roll with that for now. So what they essentially argued was that capitalism is inherently bad for the environment because it's short-termist. I have 4 responses I want to make quickly to this. The first one is that that's a lie. Businesses are not short-termist because their share price recognises the fundamental underlying factors determining the long-term longevity of that company. If your company is going to expire in 10 years, your share price will reflect that, so your overwhelming incentive is to make sure that your company will not expire in 10 years and maximise your share price. Secondly, the resources and environment of the world is recognised by a market-based proxy, which is futures market. For example, peak oil is represented by the price of oil futures. If genuinely was a disjoint between the price of futures and the actual likelihood of environmental damage in the long term, there would be a lot of opportunity for money to be made, and I recommend that the closing government goes and invests. The fact that they're not millionaires using their secret knowledge actually shows us that the market-based mechanisms correctly price for the likelihood of these resources running out, and so correctly account for the likelihood of environmental damage. Thirdly, the government can intervene without fettering capitalism and simply put a price on environmental damage. You can have an emissions trading scheme which internalizes externalities without damaging capitalism in any fundamental way. That is a solution to all of their problems, and one that doesn't require dismantling the global capitalist system. Finally, they never explained why governments, in the absence of capitalism, will be any better at protecting the environment. They are only accountable to voters, and voters are particularly short-termed in their focus because they often don't bear the immediate cost of environmental decisions they make, unlike companies that do so. For those 4 reasons, their extension falls out of this debate, and we'll return to what it's actually about. So let's talk about poor people then and capitalism, because the narrative that we got from that side of the house is that capitalism wants people to be poor. We're not quite sure how a mechanism of exchange can have desires and wants. In fact, we think that the desire to have poor people, to exploit people, to hoard resources rest with people. And the problem is, people don't exercise those harms through capitalism, they exercise them through government. That's why everything they pointed to, from the invasion of Iraq to people being discriminated against, were actually failures of government wielded against the people. So we say that the heart of the problem is minimising the likelihood that government will be used for ill, and we say for a whole bunch of reasons, capitalism is one of the ways that we minimise that. The first thing we'd say is that capitalism's actual desire isn't to exploit people or to keep people poor, it's merely to make a profit. And if the way that you make a profit is by exploiting the government, the obvious solution, given capitalism's benefits, is to simply minimise the power of government. And that's a general philosophical thrust that we would take. We'd also say that capitalism creates circumstances where you're less likely to want to use the role of the government to do things like go to war. Firstly, war is disruptive and it harms your business interests. It destroys wealth. And what's important to remember is that for every arms company that makes money selling missiles, there are companies building farms and capital investment in these countries who are lobbying the government in another way. Those counter-incentives only exist in a capitalist system, which creates the interdependence that we talk about. More about that later. So what causes a conflict, ladies and gentlemen? The first thing we'd identify that causes conflict is identity. The idea of insiders and outsiders, in-groups and out-groups, differences between people. Capitalism undermines those differences between people that lead to conflict because it creates a globalized society where people contact and trade and move across borders and basically facilitate relationships between people. That breaks down the sense of in-groups and out-groups and creates a sense of shared global identity which is antithetical to conflict. Closing.
Has the Occupy Wall Street movement been a sign of unity across society or possibly division?
Well, we say that the Occupy Wall Street movement is often protesting against government failure, which is corporate cronyism, right? And we say that the way you solve corporate cronyism is by minimising the power of the state, by having unfettered capitalism. You can't have corporate cronyism when the government doesn't control the rules of the game, which is by definition unfettered capitalism. How else do we minimise conflict? We reduce class and sectarian boundaries, because class and sectarianism and those things are only able to be wielded in a situation where we can rely on state power. It is highly unprofitable as a free market enterprise to refuse to sell to customers because of their class or because of their ethnicity. You'll be outcompeted by people willing to sell to anyone for the right price, and so you go out of business. It's only when you can rely on government monopolies to preserve your bigotry that you're able to do that. So capitalism actually undermines discrimination by making bigots unsuccessful, and that actually reduces the likelihood of those bigots using things like nationalism and racism to trigger warfare. What else does capitalism undermine? It undermines the sense that governments have that the world economy is winner takes all. That's why I made that point of information about mercantilism. Because under mercantilism, you had the sense that you had to hoard resources. But under global capitalism, you realize that it's not winner takes all. If you share and trade beneficially between each other, you can actually end up with better outcomes on the ground. That's what creates trade routes and interdependence and large multinationals who have a stake in preserving peace and prosperity in the countries where they've built factories and have capital investment. The final thing then to talk about then is nationalism and inequality, which is really the plank of the opening government case, which we think still doesn't stand in this debate. Because what we say is that nationalism stems from the sense that the state is the single most important factor in identity, and that comes directly from the state having substantial power in your life, by being involved in the provision of resources, by being involved in the provision of things like jobs. By undermining the power of state, by creating non-state, delocalized power bases like corporations, you actually undermine that sense of identity because you destroy the direct resource link between people and the state. That's what undermines the sense of nationalism that creates militarization and leads ultimately to war. The last thing then to talk about then is inequality, because we think capitalism actually destroys inequality in the real sense of the word. Because what we say is that while some people are richer and poorer, in the absolute sense, they're all richer. And that's something that we like under the status quo. We also say that the incentive for capitalists isn't to keep people poor, it's to make them rich so they become a market for your goods. So for all of those reasons, we at Closing Opposition believe that capitalism actually undermines the causes that lead governments to go to war, and for those reasons we're proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. We now invite the last speaker of the side of the government.
All right, may I begin? What's that government is bringing you in closing, which I think is going to be core to this debate's evaluation, is that we've proven why this is the greatest harm, being completely consistent with OG. Because our extension concerns about how capitalism is the biggest factor that undermines institutions that bring world peace. Because Ashish talked about how this undermines the power structures in democratic institutions which are supposed to correct for market failure, but don't. He's also talked about, and they poo-pooed this, about how capitalism undermines the environment, which we really think is a major cause of world peace problems at the point you have resource conflicts, at the point where people in South Sudan are fleeing because their land has all been taken off by evil companies from China, that kind of stuff. We think at the point where we have the government being subverted by capitalism, which is acting not as a counterbalance, but as a tool of evil which sleeps with the government, we think our extension is going to win this debate. So I'm going to talk about this debate in three main areas. Number one, the really strange burdens OO tried to put on us. Number two, does capitalism act on social good? And number three, even if it doesn't, are there checks and balances? Alright, first contention. What did OO say? They said two really strange things. Number one, they said these harms could also exist in a communist system or dictatorship. Mr. Speaker, we cannot epistemologically access a counterfactual where the whole world is communist. They've put a very insane and unreasonable burden on Gulf side to prove. Not just that, we think that a world with less inequality is probably a good thing. So we are perfectly happy to defend OG's stand on that. The second thing they say is that greed doesn't equal capitalism. Greed is the excess of wants over resources. Last I checked my economics textbook, that's basically capitalism enshrined. Because Ashish talked about how capitalism enshrines in the concept of property rights people's ability to be really greedy and really power-seeking, about how it subverts democratic power structures where the politicians who are supposed to make laws to protect the people don't make laws to protect the people. So that deals with their strange burdens. Let's get on to the real debate. Oh, sure.
One of the biggest complaints of conservatives in many countries is that globalization has reduced the identity and culture that they keep uniquely. Surely that has reduced conflict and so is a benefit of capitalism.
And their efforts to aggrandize their identity because they believe Western capitalists are stealing all their resources often just leads to worse conflict in Bolivia, in Paraguay, in Uruguay. You get the idea. Alright, now, first contention, that of does capitalism act for social good? Under this we have a slew of arguments from both opening and closing. The first thing they say is that capitalism allocates resources to people equally. Ashish already dealt with this. He says that capitalism makes money and allocation is stacked in favor of capital owners, like large MNCs who take advantage of weak laws in third world countries to prey on poor workers. Where we bring you extensions in CG is that the government, which is incentivized to protect worker rights, doesn't do so because oftentimes these candidates are bankrolled by the very same people. This is a problem. The second thing they talk about is that this creates the rise of a middle class to question the government and talks about causes like human rights and women's rights. Well, last I checked, my friends in the Occupy movement who are currently protesting in Chicago and Oregon are protesting against capitalism sleeping with state power because the government, which is supposed to make rules to check people, doesn't check them. Here's the key. Capitalism doesn't care about distribution. For every middle class who's empowered in the first world armchairs, there's a lot of people in the third world, the poor, who are left behind and who have no access and meaningful way to change their fate. That's a big problem. The other thing we get out of closing, moving on to what closing said, is that everyone is a market. We want to sell business to them. We won't hurt them. But common economics tells us, and this is what Ashish again tells you, is that only people who are able to pay constitute effective demand. Like, we are talking about high-end investors who are catered to by capitalism, not the bottom of the pyramid that Jamshed Barucha talked about in his book. For these people, yeah, we take their natural resources, we send our firms in, we exploit their land, we leave them disenfranchised, and that's when all their arguments about, like, I'm afraid the Western capitalism taking my culture, that's why I get riots in South America over private ownership of gas. We think it's a direct harm on world peace. Here's the thing, Ashish already talked about in his opening how capitalism doesn't quantify human rights, it thinks about a return, which is why like China is sponsoring multiple dodgy governments in sub-Saharan Africa without caring for human rights, without caring for world peace. There's a direct clash. No. Alright, next thing CO says about how war is disruptive on the whole, it hurts business, therefore capitalist countries don't want to go to war. Let's draw a careful distinction here between capitalism and unfettered capitalism, because the instinct to make profit is probably a good thing, but when it goes too far, when it doesn't care about society, that's when you get really silly laws like in USA, Citizens United, that treats like capitalist entities as human voters. That's where you get third world people funding states like Venezuela, which is where Hugo Chavez is perpetually bankrolled by private oil firms. That's why President, unfettered capitalism, which doesn't see the human cost and the harm in the third world, just keeps bankrolling them just because it can. That's a problem. Then they also say, lastly, out of CO, that capitalism creates an alternative power base because governments are evil. See, this point begs the question that what are capitalists like in the first place? Bear in mind, Ashish already told you, at the point where the functional power base in any country is the government with ability to make laws, and capitalism wants to subvert those, it will go with the government. In which case, both of them act in concert, they are not a counterbalancing force. Right. Even if we prove that capitalism is evil, are there checks and balances that are sufficient? Which is my second area of contention. Under this, there's a few arguments. The first thing they said is that there's a self-correcting mechanism because rich people will sponsor a good candidate. Like, here's the rebuttal that Ashish and I brought you. Like, capitalism is me first, ultimately speaking. Rich people in a country don't care about international good in other countries where the natural resources are. That's why rich countries are perfectly willing to block trade deals in Doha and take resources in Africa, causing tribal struggle. That's how it harms world peace. They then talk about there's a corporate social responsibility culture that keeps capitalism in check. Bear in mind, Mr. Speaker, not only is corporate social responsibility only a first world concept, it is often enforced by environmental standards and worker legislation. At the point where the government has to come in and put fetters on capitalism, this probably means that unfettered capitalism is a really bad thing. Ashish also told you firmly about the environment, about how these firms only look at short-run profit and don't internalize the long-run environmental good. It's precisely because business costs are so low in the third world that every time they despoil, like, I don't know, the Niger River Delta, they just up and move somewhere else because they can just do that kind of thing. The last thing CEO talked about are like share prices and futures markets will help correct the companies if they do something like that. Here's the problem with that. We tell you that if you make a short-run loss, like Ashish told you, to your share price, markets will panic and investment will fly. In this climate, I don't think can afford that. But furthermore, large businesses have multiple arms because they're conglomerates. They have financial arms, they have retail arms. They're virtually immune to loss of environmental degradation because their core business lies in financing. They don't care and they can afford to do all this. Because we've proven as closing on multiple levels that OO's burdens are irrelevant, that capitalism acts for not social good, especially in the case of the environment, and because checks and balances are hamstrung when the government is the bedfellow of the environment and the capitalists, we are very proud to propose.
Thank you, sir. Now to close our debate, I'd like to invite the final speaker on the side of the opposition.
If the problem is governments being captured and used by capitalists for harmful reasons, then it makes no sense for that side of the House to support fetters, which are the government having more power to react to the market, more power overseas, and more ability to be used by big interests. Because that's what this debate has to be about. It can't happen in a vacuum where we discuss capitalism on its own. We need to understand that what they are doing is fettering something, yet the problem that they have is government control, the root of that fetter, and where that fetter must come from. It's not good enough to say that governments plus capitalism are bad, therefore capitalism is bad, just like you can't rely on a logical leap saying mercenaries with guns are bad, so guns should never be bad. They need to do exactly what Hugh realised subtly that they needed to do, that democracy and capitalism are different things, and that when you start to fetter it, it's harmful. We support unfettered capitalism, and that means businesses will not be able to control governments because the government and the business sphere are very, very separate, and we operate in a state, a very Victoria University style state, where there's very minimal government. No thanks. 3 points to talk about. First of all, an introduction about capitalism and explaining to them why it's important that they engage on that side, on that stuff in the debate. Secondly, the question, does capitalism cause war? And thirdly, the question, how does capitalism lock in peace? Stuff that we've had no response to yet from the government benches. No thanks. So capitalism isn't actually the evil driving us to the war. We've heard time and time again from them that it's not capitalism, but it's the way that capitalism is able to use political power. Because it wasn't actually Halliburton that went to war in Iraq, was it? It was the US government. Again, in all of the scenarios they've given us, it was the government that was the problem and not capitalism, not the fundamental underlying things that have been pointed to. Trade, services, goods, people getting on because people trade with one another. That's why the best examples of very, very peaceful countries are the examples of countries with very small government. Countries like Singapore, countries like Germany, countries where the government does not get involved in capitalism. Those are the most peaceful countries. And all of the not peaceful countries, the ones that they've talked to us about, are the ones with a strong feta, are the ones with governments who try to protect from boom and bust, are the ones with governments who try to get involved in markets. No, thank you. Second and major question in this debate, how does capitalism cause war? We don't think it does, and this is a major sway of response which Richard gave you. So, the first question out of this is about resource hoarding and wars. Again, capitalism isn't actually a movement itself. Capitalism doesn't go to war, it's a vehicle used by people. And that's why it was interesting that Hugh admitted that democracy does not equal capitalism, that they're different things and therefore must be assessed differently. Governments go to war all the time, that's the stuff I've just given you. But secondly, and the crucial point, is capitalism actually fights the incentives that operate on government? No thanks. Government is in charge through people, so government is in charge through a majority rule, and that can be very, very harmful. Capitalism is never in charge through majority rule. Capitalism means that the winners are the people who engage with the most, far beyond a majority, because the biggest markets are found by advertising, by marketing to 100% of the population. That's why capitalism is always going to be better for people getting along, and is going to create better scenarios for winners and losers than governments alone. Ben.
Not all state power is a fetter on capitalism. For instance, having a military. That capital can extend its power into politics to get it to go to war doesn't represent a fetter on capitalism. In fact, quite the opposite.
Okay, so that's exactly the point. You say that big businesses are able to capture governments. Do you know how they're able to capture governments? Exactly what we just heard from the government whip, which is that governments try to fetter capitalism and big businesses are allowed to get around it and are unfairly advantaged under the system. It's exactly what we heard from government whip. Okay, continuing on this. The second point to make is one that hasn't been responded to, which is that capitalism breaks down difference. Ben made a big hay about ethnicity being a problem without ever truly explaining it. Ethnicity is a great example of where capitalism breaks down borders. In fact, when Egypt started trading with Israel, previously enemies, ethnicity was something that came to the fore as being assisted because those people traded, because those people discussed more, because those people sat down more often. The opposite scenario between, say, Cuba and the United States was not beneficial for people meeting with a different ethnicity and understanding their goals. We think that that's analysis, crucially, which needs to be responded to by the government benches, and sadly, it's too late for them. Okay, the environment. This was a little bit of a joke, and they never responded to the 2 points that Richard gave you. First of all, the businesses care about the long term. Of course they do. All of the businesses that they thought were so evil have been around for decades and decades. Businesses have an incentive to stay in the long term, and CEOs have an incentive because every one of their businesses that fails means that they're unlikely to be picked as a board member for the next business they're on. Closing.
We're not talking about long-term interests in a vacuum. These are for specific analysis for the first time about why environmental harms do not factor into the capitalist calculus, why that's extremely harmful.
Sorry, you can't just say you're not talking about the long term when this debate is about the long term because you've shown the businesses have a long-term interest to grab resources, right? This is absolutely about the long term. Businesses will fail if they promote unproductive practices. Secondly, though, we said we're allowed to have an emissions trading scheme. It's absolutely fine for businesses to understand the capitalist cost of what we're doing. No response to that. Okay. The crucial point to talk about now, before we move on to how capitalism locks in peace, is this idea of the poor. No thanks. We had a lot of sway and hay thrown at us about how we create winners and losers, never realising the crucial fact, which is that we create maybe relative winners and losers, but everyone is still better off. More people are employed, more people are in useful scenarios, and people are able to trade to bring wealth to themselves. And that's what capitalism at its heart is. People trading for mutually beneficial ends. If you halt that, or if you put fetters on that, fewer people have what they want, and you have a bigger incentive for governments with majority-only incentives to have winners and losers. Third and final question is how does capitalism lock in peace? No thanks. The first point here is that you have a lot more regional cohesion, and this is kind of what I talked about with Egypt and Israel. Because capitalism structures regions for collaboration. People come together, people form economies of scale in their regions, and people negotiate so that they can trade better and more fairly with their partners. ASEAN, NAFTA, even the Arab League these days are all groups who have come about from the cohesion brought from capitalism, and that means that those are groups who are less likely to go to war with each other. It's incredibly simplistic, but it's also true that no two countries that have Starbucks or no two countries that have McDonald's have ever gone to war with each other. It sounds simplistic, but it's true that once you have trade ties with another country, once you have your own businessmen operating in their country, once you have currency exchange happening every day and constant negotiations, you are less likely to go to war with that country because it is in your direct disincentive to go to war with that country. Further though, Third-party countries want to get involved because if the region is unstable, it's harmful for their trade too. Exactly why we've seen Vietnam and China weigh in on border disputes between Cambodia and Thailand. Something you would assume that they don't actually care all that much about, but they do because it undermines stability in ASEAN, because capitalism means that they have a stake there, because capitalism brings third parties in. That side of the House has never been able to respond to all of that analysis about why capitalism helps regional players and also helps people with differences to come together. Because the most important thing in capitalism is that you trade to the highest number of people that you can. You stop caring about ethnicity when they're viable trading partners, as opposed to other scenarios where you're not allowed to trade with people, where the majority rule, where the government cliques hold on to everything themselves. Ben doesn't believe anything that he said because Ben doesn't want to lose his trust fund. He wants to continue to go to Oxford. We don't believe anything that the government benches have said. We think that fetters on capitalism are a bad thing. It's government that's a harm, not capitalism. We stand in opposition.